He wrestled soldiers, smoked cigarettes, and went to war. But he wasn't a man, he was a bear. His name was Wojtek. And in the middle of World War II, this 6-foot brown bear would drink beer with Polish troops, march beside them into battle, and one day hold an official rank in the army. It all began in 1942 in the dusty mountains of Iran. A small group of Polish soldiers, weary and half-starved, were traveling through the countryside after escaping Soviet captivity. They were part of what was left of the Polish army, men who had survived exile, hunger, and war. But none of them expected that their new recruit would walk on 4 legs. Near a remote village, they saw a young shepherd boy clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a trembling brown bear cub, barely alive, its eyes wide and frightened. The boy explained that hunters had killed its mother. The soldiers, moved by pity, offered him a few coins, some tinned meat, and chocolate. And just like that, the Polish army had adopted a bear. They named him Wojtek, meaning the joyful warrior. He was small, clumsy, and always hungry. In those first weeks, the soldiers fed him condensed milk from an empty vodka bottle, played with him, and taught him to trust humans again. The men laughed as the bear tried to walk upright, stumbled over boots, and chewed on helmets like toys. But Wojtek was growing fast. Every morning when the men lined up for roll call, he'd stand behind them, mimicking their movements. During training, he'd chase after trucks, and in the evenings he'd curl up by the campfire, listening to the crackle of flames and the sound of old Polish songs. He wasn't just a mascot. He was a part of the family. The soldiers of the Polish Second Corps were far from home. They had no idea if they would ever see their country again. Most had lost families, homes, and friends. But Wojtek brought something back to them: laughter, innocence, and a strange kind of peace. He would sit with them while they ate, begging for food like a dog. And when they gave him fruit, he'd gently hold it in his paws and nibble carefully. But he preferred beer. Oh, how he loved beer. When the men celebrated a victory or got a rare day off, they'd hand him a bottle. Wojtek would grab it, tilt his head back, and drink it down, foam dripping from his fur. And when they smoked, he wanted that too. He'd take a cigarette, put it in his mouth, and puff, or at least pretend to. When the soldiers laughed, he'd swallow it whole and burp like a true veteran. But he wasn't just comic relief. He was smart, unnervingly smart. He learned the meaning of uniforms, of salutes, and even of orders. He would obey commands, march alongside columns, and when the men trained with weights, Wojtek would lift heavy crates and barrels as if showing off his strength. As the months passed, the Polish unit became known as the Soldiers with a Bear. Wojtek wrestled the men, played with them, and sometimes even stood guard. One night, he chased away a thief who had tried to sneak into the camp. The soldiers joked, "We have a better sentry than the British." By 1943, the war was shifting again. The Polish Second Corps received orders to move west, to join the Allied forces in Italy. They would help push the Germans out of the mountains and fight for freedom once more. But when it was time to board the transport ship in Alexandria, there was a problem. British officers at the port refused to let the bear on board. No animals, they said, military cargo only. The Polish soldiers looked at each other. Leave Wojtek behind? Impossible. He wasn't a pet. He was one of them. So they found a loophole, a brilliant one. They officially enlisted him. Wojtek was entered into the Polish Army's records as a private. He got his own paybook, serial number, and rations. He was assigned to the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. On paper, he was a soldier of the Allied forces. When the British captain saw a giant bear walking up the gangway with papers in paw and a cap on his head, he nearly fainted. But it was all real. Private Wojtek, the soldier bear, was now on active duty. The soldiers cheered as the ship sailed away from Egypt. The air was filled with laughter, songs, and the smell of beer. Wojtek sat among them, staring out at the open sea, his fur blowing in the wind. For the first time, he seemed calm, almost thoughtful. No one could explain it, but the men swore the bear understood what was happening. When bombs fell in the distance, Wojtek would look toward the horizon, ears twitching, muscles tense. It was as if he knew that his time to serve, truly serve, was coming. The journey to Italy was long and rough. The soldiers shared everything with Wojtek: food, blankets, jokes, and fear. When someone got homesick, they'd rest their head against his shoulder, and the bear would sit still, silent, like he understood their pain. One British officer later wrote, "In a war full of death, Wojtek reminded us of life." When they arrived in Italy, the soldiers could feel it. The war was waiting for them. Ahead lay the mountains of Monte Cassino, one of the most brutal and blood-soaked battlegrounds of the Second World War. And there, amid the mud, explosions, and chaos, Wojtek would become more than just a symbol. He would become a hero. The Italian mountains were painted in blood. It was early 1944, and the war in Europe had reached one of its most violent chapters, Monte Cassino. A fortress on a hill, guarded by German forces, stood like a stone monster between the Allies and Rome. Every inch of the mountain was mined, every path watched, every breath dangerous. The Polish Second Corps, battered but unbroken, was ordered to climb those hills and take the stronghold. And among them marched a bear. Wojtek was no longer a cub. He was huge now, 6 feet tall, standing upright, over 250 kilograms of muscle, fur, and loyalty. Soldiers said he could lift things 2 men couldn't. His eyes were calm but sharp, like he understood the gravity of the mission. When the battle began, the earth shook with artillery fire. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and death. Trucks rumbled back and forth carrying shells and ammunition, the lifeblood of war. The men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company were responsible for that lifeline. Without them, the guns would go silent. Without them, the mountain would be lost. And that's where Wojtek stepped forward. As shells exploded around the camp, men scrambled to carry heavy artillery crates up the slope to the gun positions. It was exhausting work. Each box weighed over 100 pounds. But in the chaos, something unbelievable happened. Wojtek stood up on 2 legs, grabbed one of the crates with his massive paws, and began walking upright toward the artillery line. The men froze for a second, staring in disbelief. Then they cheered. The bear, their bear, was helping them fight a war. He carried box after box, never dropping a single one. Through smoke, mud, and falling debris, Wojtek marched beside his comrades. Shells whistled overhead, machine guns rattled in the distance, and still he moved, calm, steady, fearless. Some soldiers tried to take the load from him, but he refused. When they shouted, he growled softly as if saying, "I can handle it." From that day on, Wojtek wasn't just a mascot. He was one of the crew. The men of the 22nd Company painted his image on their trucks, a bear carrying an artillery shell, and it became their official emblem. Every soldier wore it with pride. The legend spread through the Allied forces. British, American, and even Indian troops stationed nearby would come just to see him. Some didn't believe the stories until they saw a full-grown bear calmly walking through a war zone, carrying ammunition like a trained loader. One officer wrote later, "He worked with the same discipline as any man. He waited for his turn, carried his load, and followed the line." When night came, Wojtek would sit near the campfire, licking the sweat and dust off his fur, his massive chest rising and falling with exhaustion. The men would pat his head, offer him bread and beer, and laugh despite the horrors around them. To Wojtek, they toast, the bravest bear in the army. The bond between them was unbreakable. When shells landed close, Wojtek would instinctively move toward the sound, not away from it. Sometimes he'd nudge soldiers who froze in fear, pushing them to take cover. It was as if he understood the rhythm of battle. One morning, during a fierce German counterattack, the ammunition truck was hit. Shells scattered everywhere. The men panicked. If those rounds detonated, the entire camp could be wiped out. But Wojtek didn't hesitate. He lumbered forward, picking up the shells one by one and carrying them to safety. The soldiers screamed for him to stop, terrified the explosions would kill him. But the bear kept going, ignoring the chaos, saving what he could. That moment sealed his legend. When the battle finally ended, Monte Cassino was a graveyard. Tens of thousands had died, Germans, Poles, Brits, Americans. The monastery atop the hill was nothing but ruins. But the Polish flag flew high, carried by men and one bear who refused to surrender. For their bravery, the entire 22nd Artillery Supply Company was honored, and Wojtek, too, was promoted, officially recognized as a corporal in the Polish army. He didn't understand medals or rank or ceremony. All he knew was that the men he loved were smiling, patting his head, and cheering his name. When reporters later asked soldiers about him, they didn't talk about the drinking or the cigarettes. They talked about his courage. One man said, "He reminded us what loyalty meant." Another said, "He was one of us. He just happened to have fur." As the war dragged on, Wojtek became something greater than a soldier. To many, he was a symbol of the indestructible Polish spirit. Exiled, wounded, but never broken. He was proof that even in the darkest places, humanity and friendship could survive. There were times when the men thought about what would happen after the war. Could Wojtek ever go back to the wild? They knew the answer. No. He wasn't wild anymore. He belonged to them. He was family. After the victory at Monte Cassino, the 22nd Company continued to fight across Italy. Wherever they went, Wojtek went too, riding in trucks, marching in parades, even posing for pictures with generals. Allied troops would stop and salute him, laughing, calling him the Soldier Bear. But for the Poles, it wasn't a joke. It was pride. They'd seen him stand with them in the line of fire. They'd watched him work when men were dying around him. They'd seen the impossible, a bear fighting a war. And in those moments, they believed something powerful. If even a bear could stand against evil, maybe humanity still had hope. The spring of 1945 came with whispers of peace. The war was ending. Germany was collapsing. And the men of the 22nd Company, now heroes, began preparing to go home. But for many of them, there was no home left. Poland was gone, swallowed again, this time by the Soviet Union. Their families were missing, their cities destroyed. And so, just like them, Wojtek too became a refugee. He had been born in the wild, but his fate was tied to war and men. He had no forest to return to, no den, no mother. His only home was them. As their trucks rolled north toward the end of the war, the soldiers looked at him, the same bear they'd found as a cub in a forgotten village, and wondered what future awaited him now. They didn't know it yet, but Wojtek's story was far from over. When the war finally ended, the world erupted in celebration. Fireworks, cheers, flags waving high. But for the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps, the victory felt hollow. They had fought bravely, bled in foreign lands, and won their battles. But their home, Poland, was gone again. The Soviet Union had taken control. The country they dreamed of returning to no longer existed as they remembered it. As the men packed up their gear, One question lingered. What would happen to Wojtek? He had been more than a comrade. He was their heart. The thought of leaving him behind was unthinkable. So when orders came to transport the unit to Scotland for demobilization, the soldiers made sure he went with them. Once again, Wojtek boarded a ship, this time not to fight, but to find a home. The voyage was calm, the sea cold and quiet. Wojtek, now a decorated corporal, spent his days wandering the deck, watching the waves roll beneath him. The soldiers joked that he was making sure no German subs were around. Every so often, he'd nudge a sailor for food or sit among the men as they told stories of battles past. But there was something different about him now, a heaviness, as if he too understood the war had changed everything. When they finally arrived in Scotland, they were greeted not by crowds of cheering allies, but by silence. The war was over, and the world had moved on. The Polish soldiers were given temporary housing at Winfield Camp near the Scottish borders. It was cold, damp, and lonely. For the men who had spent years fighting, peace felt strange, quiet, and almost cruel. But Wojtek was there, and somehow that made it better. He roamed the camp freely, visiting tents, stealing food, and lifting everyone's spirits. The Scottish locals adored him. Children would come to the gates just to catch a glimpse of the giant bear who had fought the Nazis. Farmers would bring fruit and honey as gifts. He was a celebrity, the soldier bear from the war. Still, time was moving on. The soldiers who had raised him were being reassigned, some emigrating to Canada, others trying to rebuild their lives in Britain. One by one, the men left. And with every goodbye, Wojtek became quieter. He'd wander through the empty barracks at night, sniffing at bunks that once held his friends. The laughter that had filled his world was fading away. Eventually, the decision was made. Wojtek could no longer stay in the camp. He would be transferred to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he could live out the rest of his life in peace. The day of his departure was one of tears and silence. Dozens of soldiers gathered to see him off. Some saluted, others patted his fur, and a few couldn't even look. As the truck doors closed, one soldier whispered, "Goodbye, brother." When the engine started, Wojtek pressed his paw against the bars, watching the faces of the only family he had ever known disappear behind him. At the zoo, Wojtek was an instant attraction. Crowds came daily to see the soldier bear. Reporters wrote articles, children drew pictures, and veterans brought beer bottles as tributes. But behind the fame was a story few understood. Wojtek wasn't just an exhibit. He was a soldier who had lost his army. He would stand on his hind legs when he saw men in uniform, hoping to recognize someone. Sometimes, former Polish soldiers visited him, calling his name. The moment he heard the familiar Polish words, "Chodź Wojtek," "Come Wojtek," he would light up, roaring with joy, standing tall like in the old days. He'd reach out his paws as if to hug them. They would feed him beer, share cigarettes, and for a few moments, the war years came alive again. But those moments grew rare. The visitors became fewer. The world forgot. For years, Wojtek lived quietly in his enclosure. He still loved to entertain people, especially children, but his energy faded. He'd sit in his corner, staring into the distance, perhaps remembering the mountains of Italy, the taste of beer, the sound of gunfire, and the laughter of soldiers singing under the stars. The keeper said he always seemed happiest on days when veterans came. He'd grow restless before they arrived, pacing, waiting, as if he could feel them coming. And when he saw them, his entire body would shake with excitement. They'd salute him, and he'd raise his paw, just like he used to. Once again, they'd feed him beer, share cigarettes, and for a few moments, the war years came alive again. But those moments grew rare. The visitors became fewer. The world forgot. For years, Wojtek lived quietly in his enclosure. He still loved to entertain people, especially children, but his energy faded. He'd sit in his corner, staring into the distance, perhaps remembering the mountains of Italy, the taste of beer, the sound of gunfire, and the laughter of soldiers singing under the stars. The keeper said he always seemed happiest on days when veterans came. He'd grow restless before they arrived, pacing, waiting, as if he could feel them coming. And when he saw them, his entire body would shake with excitement. They'd salute him, and he'd raise his paw, just like he used to. In December 1963, at the age of 21, Wojtek passed away. The news spread quickly across Scotland, Poland, and the military world. Newspapers called him the soldier bear who carried ammunition at Monte Cassino. For the man who had fought beside him, it was like losing a brother. They gathered, old and gray now, raising a final toast. To Wojtek, they said, the bravest of us all. In time, statues were built in Edinburgh, Krakow, and London, each showing the bear standing tall, holding an artillery shell. The emblem of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, a bear carrying ammunition, was carved into stone. And even decades later, people still tell his story. Teachers tell children about the bear who went to war. Soldiers still whisper his name when they talk about loyalty and courage. Because Wojtek was never just a symbol. He was proof that friendship, no matter how unlikely, can survive the darkest of times. He wrestled soldiers, he drank beer, he smoked cigarettes, but more than anything, he showed men what it meant to be human.